That's good. Okay, today's daf is Yud Gimel of Eruvin. We are starting at the very last line of Yud Bet Amud Bet, where it says Mishum Rabbi Yishmael Amar Talmid Echad, etc. So that's really just a quote from the Mishnah. So really, we're starting with the first line of Yud Gimel Amud Aleph, but it's relating back to the Mishnah. The Mishnah recorded Rabbi Akiva Omer al Zevi al Ze Nechleku, so that it starts out just finishing up this technical point, and then it gets into a lot of Agadah that you're going to find a refreshing break from the technicalities of Eruvin today. So basically what it was talking about in the Mishnah was, we were speaking about correcting a mavoy. You have a mavoy, you have this alleyway, and at the end of the alleyway, you want to put either a lechi or a korah. You want to put some kind of a means of fixing it on the end. And the question was, Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel had a machloket. They had an argument. Do you need a side post and a crossbeam, or just either a side post or a crossbeam? And so a student said in the name of Rabbi Yishmael, they only argued here in a case where the width of the mavoy is between 4 amot and 10 amot. But if it's less than 4 amot, they didn't argue. Everyone agrees that Beit Hillel is right. And Rabbi Akiva said, no, you're wrong. Actually, they argued in all cases. Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel maintained this argument in all cases. Now that is significant for the beginning of the Gemara here. Rabbi Akiva says, Rabbi Akiva hainu tanakama. It would seem on the surface that Rabbi Akiva is merely reiterating what the first Tana said, because what did the first Tana say? He said there's an argument between Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel. He was reporting it. The argument was, do you need a side post and a crossbeam, or just one, to allow people to carry in this closed alley? The alley is closed on 3 sides, only open on one. And the student comes along and says, well, the argument was only in a limited case. And Rabbi Akiva says, no, the argument was across the board. So Rabbi Akiva is really just agreeing with the first opinion. He's not adding any content. So the Gemara says, the argument between them, there's a difference between Rabbi Akiva and the Tanakama, which is the principle that we read about yesterday. And the Gemara had said yesterday that this principle is in dispute somewhere else, but it didn't tell us where the dispute was. The question was, if you have a mavoy that's so small that it's only 4 tifachim, which is 4 handbreadths wide, does that also need to be corrected to allow you to carry in the mavoy, in the alleyway? Or do we say that a closed alleyway, if it's closed on 3 sides, and the 4th side is only open 4 tefachim, less than 4 tefachim, that's practically closed. That's not open enough to require anything. So there was so Rav Achlai, and some say it was Rav Yechiel, said that in that case, when it's that narrow, we don't require anything. And that's the machloket the Gemara is saying is between Rabbi Akiva and the Tanakama. One of them maintained that there is a minimum width necessary to justify fixing the mavoy. The other one said, no, there's no minimum width, only a maximum width where you can no longer repair the mavoy. But there's no minimum width according to those who dispute Rav Achlai. And so we don't know whether it's Rabbi Akiva that subscribes to the principle of Rav Achlai and says that there is a minimum measurement of at least 4 tefachim to require the mavoy to be fixed with a side post. We don't know if it's the Tanakama that holds like Rav Achlai that requires at least 4 tefachim in width to require you to fix the opening of the mavoy. What we do know is that they must disagree about something if both opinions are registered in the Mishnah, and this is what they're disagreeing about. We just don't know which holds which position. Which one is the one that's more lenient, meaning more lenient would mean holding like Rav Achlai, because that means if the mavoy is very narrow that you don't need anything on the end, or more stringent, that even if it is only 4 tefachim in width, you're still going to have to put a side post, you're still going to have to put a crossbeam. So that's where now the Gemara departs into a fascinating set of discussions here. Tanya, it says in the Braita. Now what it says there is velo misaymeh. We don't know which one is which. We don't know which Tana held which opinion. So Tanya, it says in the Braita, Amar Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva says, Lo Amar Rabbi Yishmael davar zeh. You are wrong, Rabbi Yishmael, because remember the student brought up in the Mishnah to Rabbi Akiva, he said that this argument between Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel, where Beit Shammai is requiring you to have a crossbeam and a side beam, and Beit Hillel is saying either one or the other is good enough, you don't need both, that's only if the mavoy is 4 amot in width. But if the mavoy is smaller than 4 amot, everybody agrees that one thing is all you need, either a crossbeam or a sidebar. Right? That's all you need. So and he said that in the name of Rabbi Yishmael. He said, that's what Rabbi Yishmael told me. If it's less than 4 amot, everybody agrees with Beit Hillel. So Rabbi Akiva said that Rabbi Yishmael never said that. He said that's impossible. Now, why did he say that? So Rashi says Rabbi Yishmael was too smart to say that. In other words, Rabbi Akiva was saying, I know Rabbi Yishmael, he never would have said something like that. That's wrong. That's what he was saying. Ella oto talmid amar davar zeh. Rather, Rabbi Akiva said that student made that up himself. That was his own chidush. He said it in the name of Rabbi Yishmael because maybe he thought he inferred it from something that Rabbi Yishmael said. But Rabbi Yishmael never said that. V'halacha oto talmid. But you know what? The halacha follows that student. What? You argue in the Mishnah. Rabbi Akiva argues with the student and says, "No, you're wrong." And now he's saying the halacha follows the student. How could that be? Ha gufa kasha, that's an intrinsic contradiction. Amarta lo amar Rabbi Yishmael davar zeh. First you said that Rabbi Yishmael never said this. Alma le'te l'chata kivate, which implies that the halacha does not follow him. Obviously, that the student is wrong. You're saying the student's wrong. He's misrepresenting or misunderstanding Rabbi Yishmael. So how can you then turn around and say the halacha follows Rabbi Yishmael? V'hadar amart, and then you said halacha koto talmid, that the student has the right opinion, that we follow the halacha follows the student. How could the halacha follow the student if you just told me that the student was wrong? That doesn't make any sense. Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Shmuel. Rav Yehuda said, Shmuel said, Lo Amar Rabbi Akiva ela lechaded ba'talmidim. That the reason why Rabbi Akiva said this was to sharpen the students. Now, normally, what it means when it says to sharpen the students is that in the Talmud is that one of the Rabbanim, one of the Chachamim, will say something purposely wrong, but in a hidden way that the students have to figure out. And say, hey, that's not right, just to test them, to see if they know what they're talking about, to see if they're on top of things, right? Here it doesn't mean that, because obviously Rabbi Akiva already said that he thought that the idea was preposterous. So why does he come along and say, halacha ke'oto talmid, that the halacha is going to follow that student? Well, how is that sharpening his students to say that? That's just nonsense, right? So Rashi explains that what it means to sharpen the students is to say that he praised the student, for even though he disagreed with the student and said, Rabbi Yishmael never said that. He was, by saying the halacha follows that student, he didn't literally mean he was ruling like the student's position, because he disagrees with the student. What he was trying to say was, there's substance to what he says. He says something here that's very important, it's worthwhile, and he wants to encourage his students to come up with their own chidushim, to come up with their own ideas and their own thoughts and their own original thoughts. And so if he dismisses the student, then people are going to feel like, oh, well, I don't want to say anything on my own because I'm going to get insulted. So he says, no, the halacha follows that student, meaning to say that this student has some substance to what he's saying. Don't dismiss it. Don't deride him for what he said. And you should feel that an impetus to be mechadesh your own original thoughts in the Beit Midrash. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak Amar, Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak says near in itmar. He didn't say the halacha follows the student. He said near in. There's that the student's words near in, they make sense. They make sense what the student's saying. Either way, he was praising the student, saying that what he said had substance, even though he disagreed with him. Amar Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi said, Kol makom shetam motzei mishum Rabbi Yishmael, Amar tamid echad, lifnei Rabbi Akiva. Anytime it says anywhere in rabbinic literature that a certain student said something in the name of Rabbi Yishmael in the presence of Rabbi Akiva, eno ela Rabbi Meir. It's referring to Rabbi Meir. Sheshimesh et Rabbi Yishmael viet Rabbi Akiva. Because he was a student both of Rabbi Yishmael and later of Rabbi Akiva, and that's why he would come to Rabbi Akiva's shiur, and he would say, oh, you know what I heard from Rabbi Yishmael, etc. Ditanya, as it says in a Braita, Amar Rabbi Meir says in a Braita, Kishayiti etzel Rabbi Yishmael, when I was learning with Rabbi Yishmael, Ayiti metil kan kantum, letoch hadiyo. I used to put this special kind of additional ingredient into the ink that I used for my sofrut, for my scribal work. Vilo Amar li davar, and he didn't say anything to me, and this special ingredient would make it more permanent. It would make the ink resistant to being erased. Kishabadi etzel Rabbi Akiva, and when I came to study with Rabbi Akiva, asara alai, he prohibited it to me. So in other words, so he tells you, he originally studied with Rabbi Yishmael, later he studied with Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Yishmael didn't bother him about adding the extra ingredient to his ink, but Rabbi Akiva did. Any, is this really correct? Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Shmuel, Rav Yehuda said that Shmuel said Mishum Rabbi Meir, in the name of Rabbi Meir, Kishayiti lomed etzel Rabbi Akiva hiti matil kan kantum l'toch hadiyo. In this version of the story, Rabbi Meir said, when I studied with Rabbi Akiva, I used to put this special ingredient in my ink. Velo amar li davar, and he didn't say anything to me. And when I came to Rabbi Ishmael and started studying with him, he said to me, my son, ma melachtecha, what is your job? What do you do for work? Amarti, I said to him, lavlarani, I am a scribe. Amarli, so he said to me, Bini, be very careful, my son, about your work, because your work is the work of heaven. If you maybe, God forbid, add a letter or subtract a letter from the Torah, you're going to end up destroying the entire world, because every letter in the Torah is so valuable. We learn out halachot from every letter in the entire in the entire Torah. We learn from every letter the presence or absence of any letter. And Rashi and the Mefarshim here give examples where subtracting a letter, for example, Hashem Elohim Emet, if you took off the Aleph, it would say Hashem Elohim Met, God died, which would be terrible. It's like Nietzsche or something like that. And it says Vayidaber Hashem. If you wrote a Vav and it said Vayidaberu, Hashem spoke in the plural. So sometimes adding can distort. Or Tosafot gives the example of putting a Bara'u instead of Bara. Bereshit bara'u Elohim. It sounds like there's more than one God. So in any case, sometimes adding a letter can have disastrous consequences. Sometimes subtracting a letter can have disastrous consequences, because we learn such important things from every letter, and the letters have significance. It doesn't necessarily mean learning halachot, details of halachot, but every letter is significant, that it changes the meaning of words, it changes the implication of things, changes the nuances of things, and therefore it's very dangerous. Amarti lo, I said to him, don't worry, I said to Rabbi Ishmael, because I have this thing called kan katum, she'ani matil letoch hadio, I put it into the ink. In other words, he was trying to explain that helped with the writing. We'll see why in a second. Amar li said to me, he said to me, are you allowed to put kan katum into the ink? But the Torah says, v'chatav umaha. With regard to the sotah, the ordeal of the sotah, it says that he writes a parchment with the parasha of the sotah, and then he has to erase it. It has to be writing that's erasable. The Torah has to be erasable. It shouldn't be easily erased, but it has to be erasable. So what's the point here? There's a problem. Two problems. First of all, in the first version of the story, he studied with Rabbi Yishmael first and later Rabbi Akiva. Secondly, and in the first story, it was Rabbi Akiva that criticized his use of the kan kantum, not Rabbi Yishmael. In this version of the story, he studied with Rabbi Akiva before Rabbi Yishmael, and it was Rabbi Yishmael that criticized him on using the kan kantum. So we have two problems, logical problems. So first though, the Gemara wants to understand what was the discussion between Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Meir? Because Rabbi Yishmael tells him, you have to be so careful with your writing and not subtracting a letter, not adding a letter. And Rabbi Meir says that I have this special ingredient that I put in my ink. What is the special ingredient in ink going to help you with adding a letter or subtracting a letter? That's about scribal error. How's it going to help me with scribal error? That doesn't make any sense. So Hachik Amar, this is what he said to him. So Rabbi Meir said to Rabbi Ishmael that not only do I not make mistakes with regard to the letters, I don't add a letter and I don't subtract dibaki ana, because I'm an expert. I'm an expert in knowing the proper spellings of words, and I don't make those kinds of mistakes. But more than that, even to worry about a fly that might come and sit on the end of a dalet and make it into a resh, because the only difference between dalet and resh is the little piece that's sticking out on the side. He said, I don't even have to worry about that. Why don't I have to worry about a fly erasing the side of the dalet and making it into a resh? Because I have this special thing. That I put this special permanent agent into the ink, permanence agent, whatever you want to call it, that prevents the ink from ever being erased, and therefore I don't have to worry about losing any of the letters I've written. So not only do I not misspell, whatever I write is permanently sealed because I use the kan kantum in my ink. Okay, so that's what he was answering him. Okay, but now we have another problem. Okay, still, kashya shimush ashimush kashya asara asara. First of all, the question is, which was the rabbi? Was it Rabbi Yishmael or Rabbi Akiva that he studied with first? there's a contradiction in the two versions. The Baraita had him studying with Rabbi Ishmael first and then Rabbi Akiva, like our Mishnah. But Rabbi Yehuda, in the name of Shmuel, had him studying with Rabbi Akiva first and then Rabbi Ishmael. So which one is correct? And who was the one who prohibited the kankantum to be added to the ink? Was it Rabbi Akiva or Rabbi Ishmael? I don't know exactly what it. No, you're not allowed to. But you're not allowed to add it. But apparently, I don't know exactly what it corresponds to.
Who puts it in there?
They used to. They put some kind of stuff in there that would make it permanent, so that it was unerasable. So what is it exactly today? I don't know what they would call it. Yeah, I'm sure that, but still, you can erase it. You can scratch off a letter. You can erase it. Yeah, you can erase it. So, so we can answer the first question of who did he study with first. Did he study with Rabbi Akiva first or Rabbi Ishmael? It's a more complicated story. He first went to study with Rabbi Akiva, but he couldn't understand Rabbi Akiva. He was too deep. He was too sharp. It was too advanced for him. So he said, you know what? He went to Rabbi Ishmael, v'gamar Gemara, and there he studied the tradition. In other words, here Gemara doesn't mean the Gemara that we study. It means he received the tradition from Rabbi Ishmael to make sure he was more prepared. It's like a person who goes to an advanced class. They say, I need to go to the class before this. It's too advanced for me. I can't understand calculus. I need to take pre-calculus or whatever. You need to take a step down, a notch down, take the prerequisite courses first. So Rabbi Meir tried studying with Rabbi Akiva. It was too hard. It was too complicated, too abstract, whatever it was. So he went to study with Rabbi Ishmael to get himself organized. So actually he studied with Rabbi Akiva both before and after Rabbi Ishmael, because he first studied with Rabbi Akiva, dropped the course, so to speak, went to study with Rabbi Ishmael, and then went back to study with Rabbi Akiva. So that's not a problem. But the question is, and then he went and studied with Rabbi Akiva, and he got into the analytics of everything. He got into the analytical learning with Rabbi Akiva, which was the advanced study. But the difficulty is, who was the one who told him he couldn't use the kankantum? So he says kashya. It's a difficulty, and the Gemara answers kashya. You're right, it is a difficulty. We can't resolve it. We don't know who it was that told him he couldn't use the kankantum. Apparently, it was a machloket. It was an argument, and we don't know. Tanya, it says in the Braita, Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Rabbi Yehuda says, Rabbi Meir Haya Omer, Rabbi Meir himself used to say, L'chol matilin kankantum. Actually, you are allowed to put kankantum in. Okay, so according to the previous Gemara, it sounded like you couldn't, but you can. L'toch hadio. Chutz mi parashat sotah. The only time you're not allowed to put in kankantum is when you're writing the parasha of sotah in the Torah. In other words, when you're writing in Parashat Naso, in Sefer Bamidbar, you're writing the section of the Sotah. There you have to use ink that could be erasable. Because in theory, that piece could be used for the Sotah. Because the Sotah has that piece of her own, parasha erased into the water that she drinks, right? So you're allowed to use permanent ink in every place except for the Parashat Sotah. Rabbi Yaakov Omer Mishimo. Rabbi Yaakov said in the name of Rabbi Meir that Chutz mi Parashat Sotah Sheba Mikdash. Rabbi Meir did not mean that every Sefer Torah in the world you have to use a different ink for Parashat Sotah than everywhere else. In other words, it doesn't mean that when you write all the other parashiot all the other 53 parashiot of the year, you need to use permanent ink. And then when you come, or you can use permanent ink. And then when you come to Naso, there's one section you have to write with erasable ink. Right? It doesn't mean that. He means that when you do the ritual of the Sotah in the Beit HaMikdash, it has to be erasable, obviously. But he didn't mean to say that the one in the Sefer Torah has to be erasable, and that's what the halacha is, that it could be, the writing in the Sefer Torah can be permanent. It doesn't have to be. That's what they were saying before. In other words, that's what he was saying before. But now, right? But it could be, right? That, in other words, the Gemara before was saying that Rabbi Meir was told that you're not allowed to use this permanent ink, but the halacha is you can add anything to the ink
today.
Right? As long as the ink is black. Right, we use black ink, but really it could be even made of anything, as long as it's something that's not going to, that's going to work.
And by erasable, we mean it's scraped off. It's not like
it can be erased in water. If it were put in water, it would come off, as opposed to something that wouldn't come off. That's what they're talking about with the Sotah. They dip it in the water. No, because we're allowed to use permanent ink today.
I understand that too.
Yeah.
Erasing in practice today.
They don't do it. No, we scrape off letters. We never dip it. We never use water. No, it would ruin the parchment. No, we scrape. It's less messy. So my benayhu, what's the machloket? Amar Rav Yirmiyah says, Limchok la min Torah ika benayhu. The machloket here is, are you allowed to use the parchment of the Torah itself for the sotah? In other words, one side is saying, what the first opinion was saying that according to Rabbi Meir, in theory, you could actually cut that piece out of the Sefer Torah and use it for the sotah. So therefore you have to make sure that it's up to the standards and specifications of the sotah, which means to say that it has to be erasable. However, Rabbi Yaakov's version was no. The only time it has to be erasable is when you've prepared the separate parchment for the sotah, but you're not allowed to cut it out of the Sefer Torah and use it. So you don't have to make it erasable in the Sefer Torah because there's no way you would ever use that for the sotah. And these Tanaim are the same as the following. Tanya, as it says in the Braita, En Megillat Kshera lahashkot basota acheret. Rabbi Achai bar Yoshia Amar Megillat Kshera lahashkot basota acheret. There's a machloket in the Braita. Let's say you prepared a Megillah for the sotah. There's a sotah that's being judged, and you prepared the parchment for her, and she confesses to the crime. So she doesn't have to drink the water now. You don't have to erase it anymore. So now you have this Megillat Sotah that's been written for this accused wife and nothing to do with it. So now another woman comes in who's accused. Can you use that for the new woman? So it's a machloket. The first position says, En Megillat Kshera lahashkot basotah, that you cannot give a sotah acheret, another sotah, the same Megillah. Since it wasn't erased, you might think that you could, but you can't. And Rabbi Achai bar Yoshia says you can. It's generic. It's a generic form document. Since you wrote the generic form document, now another woman comes in, use it for her, no problem. So Amar Rav Papa says, Dilma lohi. You're making a comparison here. What was the Gemara's comparison? The Gemara was saying the same machloket that we see above. That one side says that what's written in the Sefer Torah can be used for sotah. If you cut it out of the Sefer Torah, you could use it. The other side says no. Same machloket here. Because what are they saying? Since it wasn't written for her, the first opinion says, you can't use it for a woman it wasn't written for. And the Sefer Torah was not written for the sotah, so you can't use it for her. Same logic, in other words. It has to be written for the recipient. And the one that says that you can use permanent ink for the entire Torah, because you cannot cut out the section in Parashat Naso from the Sefer Torah and use it for sotah. Why? Because it must be written for her. The other side says it doesn't matter. You have to use erasable ink because you could cut it out of the Sefer Torah because it doesn't have to be written for her. So the same machloket is here. Does it have to be written for the sotah or not? Does it have to be written for that individual sotah or not? So it's the same thing. But Rav Papa says it's not analogous. Why not? Dil malohi. Ad kan lo kamar tana kama hatam el kevan de intik lishum Rachel tu lo hadra mintika lishum le'ah. Aval gabe Torah distama michteva hachinami demachkinan. You know what? You could say that when you write the Megillah for a particular sotah, it's worse than the Sefer Torah. You know why? Because let's say woman number one comes in and I write the Megillah for her and then she confesses. We don't have to erase it. We don't have to put her through the ordeal. Now woman number two comes in. Same problem. Can I use it for woman number two? No, because it was actually specifically written for woman number one. But the Sefer Torah, that wasn't written for anybody. So maybe even the one who says that I can't use a Megillat Sotah written for A, I can't reassign it now to B, I can't do that, might still say that a Sefer Torah that's for everybody. So really I could still use the Sefer Torah. And Amar Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak Dilma lohi, another reason why the two arguments are not analogous is because Ad kan lo kamar Rabbi Achai bar Yoshia, who says you can switch the Megillat Sotah from one Sotah to another. Even he wouldn't allow you to use the Sefer Torah because Hatam, why? Ela de'echtiv mihat l'shum Sotah ba'olam. Aval gabe Torah l'dil hitlamed ketiva hachinami dela machkinan. So what he says is that basically when it comes to the Sefer Torah, it's not written for a Sotah at all. So in other words, either way that you hold, whether if you say that a woman, that the Megillat Sotah has to be written for the particular woman who's going to receive it, and it can't be switched from woman to woman, you still might allow the Sefer Torah to be used because it's written for everybody. And on the other hand, even the one that says that you can allow the Megillah to be switched from woman to woman, might say you can't use the Sefer Torah, because at least the Megillat Sotah that was written for a woman named Leah, and then another woman named Leah comes, or another one with another name. It doesn't have to be the same name, actually. In Get, it's another story. But the first woman comes in and she leaves. The second woman comes. Even the one that says it's generic, you can use it for anybody, might still say you can't use the Sefer Torah, because the Sefer Torah wasn't written to be used in the Sotah ritual at all. So the point is that no matter what you hold about transferring the Sotah parchment from one Sotah to another, cannot tell you what you're going to hold about the Sefer Torah. Because we could say the Sefer Torah is even better than switching from one to the other, because it's written for everyone, it's universal. We could say it's even worse, because it's not written for any Sotah. And at least here it's written for some Sotah, just not this one.
Nobody's got a problem with cutting out of the Sefer.
I guess not, or maybe it will use one that's pasul, or we would use one that was worn out. I mean, it's yeah, but that's just a theoretic. It's theoretical. Yeah. So now, does not Rabbi Achai bar Yoshia hold like the following very well-known halakha in the Mishnah? Katav get legaresh et ishto. It's a famous case of gitin. If you wrote a get to give to your wife, or a man wrote a get to give to his wife, v'nimlach umtza'o ben iro, and he changed his mind, he reconciled with his wife, they decided not to get a divorce, but somebody else in his city found it, v'amar, and he said, shivcha kishmi, v'shem ishtcha kishem ishti. So what happens? Very lucky, they both live in Rockville. His name is Bob, her name is Susan. Bob and Susan decide to reconcile. Another guy named Bob says, hey, my wife is also Susan. I want to use the same get, and we live in the same city, because it has to go by the city in which it's written. So what happens? Pasul legareshpo. You cannot use it, because it has to be written lishem haisha. It has to be written for the sake of the woman who's going to be receiving it. There's no working around that. So, hachi hashta. Is that a comparison? In other words, what they're saying is that Rabbi Achai bar Yoshia says that you can transfer a Megillat Sotah from one Sotah to the other. You wrote the Sotah parchment for one Sotah. She backs out, she confesses to the crime, whatever. Now you have the other Sotah. You can transfer it to the new one. What about a get? Does that mean that on a get he's going to say the same thing? You can transfer from woman to woman? So the answer is no. You can't compare the two. Hatam v'chatavla ketiv. So it says over there v'chatavla. V'chatavla means you write it for her, ketiv. That's what's written. Ba'enan ketiva lishma. We require writing it for the sake of the woman. Here it doesn't say you should write the Megillah for the Sotah. It just says you should do the ritual for her. Ba'inan asiyah lishma. Asiyah dida mechikahi. What is the asiyah? What's the doing? The erasing of the parchment, not the writing of it. It doesn't have to be written lishma. A get has to be written lishma. It must be written for the woman who's going to receive it. Even if the names and all the details are exactly the same, it has to be written for that woman. Right, lishma. But the Megillat Sotah, Rabbi Achai says, who says that Megillat Sotah has to be written? It never says v'chatavla. It says v'asala. It doesn't say write it for her. It says do it for her, meaning erase it into the water and do the ritual, not the writing. The writing is generic, and it makes sense, because the truth is there's nothing written in the parchment of the Sotah that has anything to do with the individual Sotah. It's a generic form. It's like, let's say for instance, that's the get. In Gitin it says v'chatavla sefer keritut. You have to write it la for her. So in Gitin that's a special halacha. The issue with, let's say, for example, ketubah. If you had a ketubot, and there's a guy named Moshe and Sarah, and they don't get married, but they made a ketubah already, and somebody else wants to get married in the same place, and the same date, same names, that's okay. Ketubah is fine. There's no halakha that the ketubah has to be written lishma. It has to be written, for the sake of the person. It's just a...
You can make a copy.
Yeah, you can make a photocopy. It's no problem. A ketubah is just a legal document. It doesn't have any kedusha or any halachic status like that. It's just a monetary document. But a get is a religious document. So a get actually has to be written lishma. It's a special thing. So now, Amar Rabbi Acha bar Chanina. Rabbi Acha bar Chanina says, "Galui v'yadu lefnei mi she'amar v'ha'olam she'en b'dorosh Rabbi Meir kemoto." It was known and it was revealed and known before the one who created the world that there was nobody in the generation of Rabbi Meir like him on his level. So if that's the case, why didn't the halacha always follow Rabbi Meir? If Rabbi Meir was the greatest scholar of his generation, shelo yachilu havirav la'amod al sof da'ato. because his colleagues could not get to the bottom of his thinking. In other words, they weren't able to understand. Rashi says, "Lo yachlu lahavin be'ezeh dvarav nechonim ve'ezeh en dvarav nechonim, she'noten da'at miyushav v'hagun al en halacha k'halacha." Because Rabbi Meir was so brilliant, he could make a perfect argument supporting something that wasn't the halacha, and you wouldn't know what he really thought. It's like the debate team, they assign you whatever your position is, you're going to argue it. He could argue both sides of an issue so well that it was so convincing, nobody could say. So people would say, I don't know if the reason why Rabbi Meir is so convincing is because it's really true. Because he was so smart, he could argue any halacha, he could argue both sides of the issue, and so they could never tell. Normally you say, wow, that's really persuasive, so I'm going to decide the halacha like this because it's very persuasive. The problem is that Rabbi Meir then 5 minutes later he'll argue the opposite side just as persuasive. You don't know what to do. So that's why they couldn't follow him. Because it says that he could say about something tameh that it was tahor and show a good reason, and he could show something that's tahor is tameh and he could show a good reason. So there's no way to know. Tana, it says in the Braita, Lo Rabbi Meir Shemo Ela Rabbi Nehorai Shemo. His name wasn't Rabbi Meir, it was Rabbi Nehorai, which also comes from the word of light. Velama Nikra Shemo Rabbi Meir. Why did they nickname him Rabbi Meir? Shehum Meir Ere Chachamim Balacha. Because he would enlighten the eyes of the Chachamim in halacha. Velo Nehorai Shemo, and actually his name wasn't Nehorai either. Ela Rabbi Nechemya Shemo. It was Rabbi Nechemya. But Nehorai also comes from the word Nahor, means light in Aramaic, like Sagi Nahor.
You're talking about Meir Balaneh.
No, Rabbi Meir, the same Rabbi Meir. The Tana, Rabbi Meir. Yeah.
So his name was Nechemya.
Really his given name was Nechemya, but they called him Rabbi Nehorai, which is more of an Aramaic term or a later Hebrew term for light. And Meir also to enlighten. Again, the name Nehorai means he lights up the eyes of the Chachamim in halacha. Amar Rabbi says, Hi, Rabbi said the reason why I was sharper than all of my colleagues, you know what it was? Because I sat behind Rabbi Meir when he was giving the shiur. He was in Rabbi Meir's class. He didn't sit in the front row because they had it in a circular formation. So some people were behind the teacher, some people were in front. He said, if I had been able to sit in the front, I would be much smarter. In other words, I would have been even sharper because I would have picked up, the Mefarshim say, I would have picked up the nuances and all of the subtleties of Rabbi Meir if I had been sitting in the front. Dechtiv, as it says, because it says your eyes will see your teacher. In other words, you should see your teacher directly when he's speaking to you. It's a more beneficial way of learning. You get more nuance, more subtlety from seeing the teacher. He said, if I were sitting in front instead of in the back, instead of behind Rabbi Meir, I would have been even sharper. Rabbi Abahu said, Rabbi Yochanan said, Talmid hayal Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir had a student, Sumchus Shemo, famous, also a Tana that appears in the Mishnah from time to time. On everything that was tameh, he would give you 48 reasons it was tameh. And on everything that was pure, he would give you 48 reasons that it was pure. In other words, he had such complex reasoning, it wasn't enough that he would come up with a conclusion of the subject, that he would know what the answer was, but he could give you many, many reasons. In other words, the halacha is so interconnected that he could give you an argument that would take you 25 steps to follow, but it would lead to the conclusion. So he could give you many, many different arguments for the same point and show that it's like different lines of reasoning. They all lead to the same point. They all demonstrate the same thing because in his mind, apparently, all the halachot were so connected, they were so interconnected, that he knew how to draw, so to speak, an argument from a very remote halacha or a very remote point back to the subject at hand, and to make multiple arguments to prove the same thing.
Is he the one with the convincing lie argument from Bava Metzia?
Which one?
A lie, simchas. A lie's got to have some truth in it, otherwise there's got to be a little bit of truth.
I don't remember if he actually said that or not.
He's mentioned.
But he's mentioned around, yeah. Tana, it says in Tosefta, Talmid Vatik Haya Bayavneh. There was an outstanding student in Yavneh, Shaya Mitayret Asheretz, B'me'ah v'chamishim tamim. He could tell you 150 reasons why a sheretz is really tahor. A sheretz is like one of the avot tum'ah. It's one of the primary categories of tum'ah. The sheretz is one of the eight crawling creatures that we learned about in Perek Shemona Shratzim in Masekhet Shabbat. That's one of them, but it's listed. The various shratzim are listed in the Torah. Hacholed v'hachbar v'atzav lemineu. So all these different things are the shratzim. So So he would give you 150 reasons why really the sheretz is tahor. So the point is that they could use their reasoning ability either to dazzle you with logical arguments that are seemingly logical, but there's a false premise in there somewhere. They're really just rhetorical arguments, or they could use it for good. So they were very sharp thinkers. Amar Ravina says, Ani adun v'atarenu. You know what? I'll be mitaher. I right now will give you logic to allow the sheretz to be tahor. If a nachash, if a snake kills and increases tum'ah because it kills other creatures, and therefore the creatures are tameh, and therefore it increases tum'ah, and yet tahor, the snake itself, is not one of the 8 shratzim. It's not one of the 8 shratzim. A dead snake is not a source of tum'ah itself. Yet it creates lots of tum'ah by killing others. Sheretz she'en memit umar betum'ah. A sheretz, one of these crawling creatures, none of them are deadly, none of them kill. And yet, so lo kol shekin, doesn't that mean that certainly the sheretz should not be tameh? Because if the nachash, if the snake that creates lots of tum'ah and lots of death is not tameh itself, so then the sheretz, which doesn't kill other creatures and doesn't increase tum'ah in the world, shouldn't be tameh itself, right? That's logical. So he says, look, I just proved to you that the sheretz is tahor, even though the Torah says it's tameh. So Amar Rabbi Abba Amar Shmuel, I'm sorry, I skipped. So it says, Vilohi, it's not really a good argument because Masekhet Eruvin Daf, it's not that the nachash increases tum'ah in the world. It's just like a thorn. All it does is bite people. It doesn't create more tum'ah. It bites the person or the animal, and the animal dies. Just like if a thorn hits you and you die from the thorn, you wouldn't say, oh, now the bushes are going to be tameh because they create tum'ah in the world. That's just the way that it works, that it bites. But the point is that the same is true of all of these arguments, obviously. They could give 150 arguments to prove false things, and somewhere in the argument is a false premise somewhere. Right? The assumption here being that anything that is responsible for more tum'ah should be more tameh. That's not necessarily true.
Sounds like the same class from Bava Metzia.
Could be, because you're using tum'ah, you're using the idea of increasing tum'ah in an equivocal manner. Because yes, it creates lots of tum'ah, but it creates it by biting, and then the person dies or the animal dies, and they're the source of tum'ah. It's not actually creating lots of tum'ah, so it's not really, the premise underlying the arguments can be spurious. So, and that argument was given by Ravina. Ravina was the one who was saying I could make an analogy. Amar Rabbi Abba Amar Shmuel. Rabbi Abba said that Shmuel said, Shalosh shanim nechal go Beit Shammai Beit Hillel halal omrim halacha kemotenu halal omrim halacha kemotenu. For 3 years, Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel argued. Beit Shammai, the students of Beit Shammai said the halacha should follow us, and Beit Hillel said the halacha should follow us. And what happened in the end? We know Yatza bat kol v'amra, a divine voice came out and said, Elu v'elu divrei Elohim chayim. Both sides are the words of the living God. Divrei Elohim chayim hen. They're words of the living God. V'halacha ke Beit Hillel, but the law follows Beit Hillel. In other words, both of them are doing this l'shem shamayim. Both of them are studying the Torah, trying to get to the truth. Hashem only asks us to get to the truth. He doesn't ask us for the absolute truth. He asks us for the best humanly graspable truth. So both Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel are speaking the words of the living God, meaning they're both absolutely valid in the eyes of Hashem because they're doing a truthful search for the correct halacha. But we have to have a bottom line, and the bottom line is we follow Beit Hillel. So if it's true, though, that both sides are equally valid in the eyes of God, they're both legitimate, they're both truthful, so why is it that we follow Beit Hillel? Why do we reject Beit Shammai? Because they were soft and they were patient people. Veshonin divrehen v'divrei Beit Shammai, and they would study both their own words and the words of Beit Shammai. They always included Beit Shammai's opinions. They were very humble like that. V'lo od, and not only that, ele shemakdimin divrei Beit Shammai l'divrehen, they even would put Beit Shammai's words before their own. They were so respectful. Ke'otash shaninu, as we learned, mishayer roshav rubo b'sukkah. This is in Masekhet Sukkah, that somebody was sitting with their body, the majority of their body and their head in the sukkah, v'shulchano b'toch habayit, and their table is inside the house. Beit Shammai poselin. Beit Shammai say that's invalid. You cannot sit in the sukkah when your table is in the house. Your table must be in the sukkah too. Beit Hillel machshirin. Beit Hillel is machshir. Beit Hillel say it's okay as long as you and your majority are in the sukkah. That's enough. The table doesn't have to be in the sukkah. And incidentally, this is a case where we actually follow Beit Shammai. We say you can't do that. Amru Beit Hillel Beit Shammai. Beit Hillel said to Beit Shammai, Lo kacha yamase. Wasn't there a story? Shehalachu ziknei Beit Shammai v'ziknei Beit Hillel levaker Rabbi Yochanan ben Achoranit. That the elders of Beit Shammai and the elders of Beit Hillel went to visit Rabbi Yochanan Achoranit. Umitzauhu yoshev v'rosho v'robo b'sukkah v'shulchan b'toch habayit. And they found that he was sitting with his body and the majority, and his head and the majority of his body in the sukkah, and his shulchan, his table, was in the house. And isn't it true that they obviously thought that was okay? And Amru Lahen Beit Shammai said to Beit Hillel, Misham Raya, you're trying to prove from there that you're allowed to sit with your head and the majority of your body in the sukkah and your table in the house? Afen Amrulo, they actually said to Rabbi Yochanan ben Achoranit, if this is how you've been doing sukkot your whole life, you've never fulfilled the mitzvah of sukkah in your life. Okay, now what is the point of bringing the story? That even when Beit Hillel was arguing with Beit Shammai, and they described the story of how the elders of Beit Shammai and the elders of Beit Hillel went to visit this rabbi, they say, elders of Beit Shammai and elders of Beit Hillel. So they themselves, Beit Hillel, when telling the story, show deference to Beit Shammai and mention them first, even in the story, because they were so humble. To teach you, that anybody who lowers himself, Hashem raises him up. And anybody who raises himself up, Hashem lowers him. Anybody who chases after greatness, greatness runs away from him. Anybody who runs away from greatness, the greatness will chase after him. Anybody who tries to force the moment, he will be forced by the moment. Anybody who allows himself to be pushed by the time, eventually the time will come for him. In other words, if you are patient and you don't try to force things, if you don't succeed at first and you're patient and you work and you wait, you will succeed. If you try to force, like Rashi says, he says that a person wears himself out to get rich and to become great, and when he sees he's not succeeding, he goes further and further, and he puts himself out there, and he raises himself up, and he tries to force things now. He says that that's not the way to do it. Don't push. Maybe now's not the time. You got to be patient. You got to build up gradually to where you want to get. Don't rush ahead, because then you'll end up falling. Tanu Rabbanan, the rabbis taught, for 2.5 years, Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel had an argument going. One said that it's better for a person that he was never created. It would have been better for a person never to have been created, because most of us, when we're born, we end up doing all kinds of averot and sins and bad things. It would have been better if we never came to begin with. We wouldn't have had to mess up the world and ruin ourselves.
Not only that, there's more mitzvot shliliot.
More negative, yeah. It's hard. Yeah. That it's better for a person to be created than not to be created. Better that you existed and you at least got some good than you got nothing. Nimnu vegamru. They took a vote on this, and they decided, we agree that it's better for a person that he hadn't been created. You probably would have been better off. You wouldn't have had to do averot. You wouldn't have had to do bad things. But achshav shenivra. But now that you are created, everybody agrees. Yipashpesh b'ma'asav. Analyze your deeds. In other words, do teshuvah for the mistakes that you've made. And some say yimashmesh b'ma'asav. Feel your deeds. In other words, weigh your actions carefully when you're going to choose whether to do a mitzvah or not. Weigh the pros and cons. Don't think that it's worth passing on a mitzvah because you're going to lose money or something like that. If there's an opportunity to do an averah, weigh your deeds. Don't think, it'll be worth it for the enjoyment in order to do the averah. So that's talking about future planning. So do teshuvah for the mistakes you've made. Try to be careful about the actions that you do, because guess what? You don't really have a choice, right? As Pirkei Avot says, a person is created against their will. The person doesn't have a choice whether to exist or not.
I heard there's something